All right. Hello, Catholic YouTube. Brian with City of the Immaculata. Back with you. Impromptu. I hope you're all having a good week. Please say a prayer for my family who spent about 5 hours yesterday at the airport, the terminal, only to have the flight canceled after that 5 hour delay. And there's no flight today, and they're planning to get a flight in the evening tomorrow. That's the hopes, anyways. But if you would ask for the intercession of St. Christopher and not only safe travels, but that they actually are able to get on the plane and get home. Fortunately, they're right near my in-laws, so they're not having to go very far, not having to get a hotel room or anything like that. But still, it's tough when you've got children in tow and you're waiting in an airport all day only to have that news break to you. Anyways, though, I was sitting here this morning thinking about this topic. Also, I've got my Militia of the Immaculata coffee cup this morning I'm representing. This is City of the Immaculata, right? So I have to represent with you all. If you take the act of consecration to Our Lady, if you register with the Militia Immaculata, Colby's Militia Immaculata, not only are you officially consecrated and in the hands of our Blessed Mother, but they also give you a cool mug. So there's some incentive for you guys to go out and do the Colbyan form of consecration, or the Louis de Montfort form of consecration for that matter. But I was sitting here this morning, I got some good questions. So gauge the interest levels. I can never gauge the interest levels in my videos based on the analytics alone. The analytics tell a story, but they don't tell the whole story. Sometimes I'll have a video that gets up into the thousands and I don't get a lot of feedback on it, but then I'll have a video that maybe gets a few hundred and I get some good feedback on it. And I had some good questions come up out of this last one that I did last Monday, I guess it would have been, on marriage. And the gist of that is, it was a debate it's the hot topic today online about whether or not it's still good for men to get married. And some questions came to me because I took a little bit of a different route than what you would maybe see on some of these other channels. I took the route of discussing marriage as a natural institution versus marriage as a sacramental act. And one of the questions that came to me was, okay, I understand what you're saying, conversation, but a question arose out of it that was, I understand what you're saying, Brian, right? There's a development that happens over time, but how do we as Catholics in the 21st century now make sense not only of the development, not only as marriage as a sacramental, one of the 7 sacraments that has been handed to us complete, but also to account for this period of time in church history where that wasn't the case? Do we need to worry about it? And I think these are all valid and good questions. as far as whether you, the average Catholic, living the life of grace and working on your own sanctity, the reality is that you don't really need to know about a lot of this stuff. Not just about marriage, not just about the kind of things that theologians and historians and intercommunal arguments and debates, that these things that kind of have been long before. I can't blame it online. I mean, these disputations have been happening for a long time. You don't necessarily need to know about these things. You don't need to know about the development of marriage as a sacrament in order to live a good, simple, healthy, holy life. But if you are going to wade into some of the debates that take place, then you do need to know about these things. You need to be aware of the process of development, but you also need to make sure that you keep the context in mind. And I had mentioned this book last week as I was doing this lecture. I totally butchered the title on it. I had to go pull it out of storage because I didn't actually have it on hand, which is why I butchered the title. The book is actually called How Marriage Became One of the Sacraments. It's by Philip Reynolds. It's not Oxford University Press, it's Cambridge University Press. So for my Cambrian friends out there, I do apologize for that mistake. I know there's a difference. I tend to want to always attribute all of the great things of the world coming out of Oxford, as I'm a lover of the Oxford tradition, but there is Cambridge as well too, we should recognize. So this is Cambridge Press. Massive, massive work. I mean, it's 1,000-page work, and it covers, you will walk away from this. The thing I love about a book like this is if you take your time with it and you actually take the time to read it, you're not just going to walk away with a very dense knowledge of marriage as a sacrament, how it came to be, but it's also a lesson in how the church works through the sacraments qua sacraments, how the church arrives at the end results of these things that we now enjoy the fruits of. I mean, he goes through, it's fairly exhaustive work. He goes through the early developments of marriage in the church, the views and the arguments around it. He spends time with Augustine's writings on it, who, Augustine had a few things to say, as he did about many things about marriage. He, he goes through some of the arguments that sort of make their way up through the early Middle Ages around, betrothal and consent, consummation, all the way up. And then we get into the where it really kind of takes off is in the 12th century. And especially by the time that we get to the writings of, well, we have the School of Leon in there, compilations of certain florilegia. There are certain texts that are sort of compiled and being reviewed at this point in time. And then I think the big juggernaut in all of this is going to be Lombard sentences, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But you also have Hugh of St. Victor weighing in on it. Then you get into the great scholastic debates on it with, of course, all of the commentaries coming out of Lombard sentences with St. Thomas and these others, all the way up through. And he ends this, which is, I think, is a good sort of capping point. He ends this with the Council of Trent. So the very first thing I think to acknowledge in this is the reality of the development of doctrine. And this is one of those ones that, like, there's times where I wish I had a little bit more of a voice in the wider Catholic community. There's more times when I'm glad that I've only got my little corner here. Like, I don't want to be, because there's pros and cons to all of these things. I like having my little quiet corner of the internet. But sometimes when I see these things like being lobbed back and forth, just say between traditionalists and progressives, for example, there's this tendency to, like, just make like a caricature of the thing that they're discussing about, and then both sides are drawing incorrect conclusions because they're drawing them from a caricature of the thing. So there's a entire field of study when it comes to the study of development of doctrine, and there's different positions on it. I happen to believe that Newman is the most correct on this, and I think that the church has leaned into Newman. I mean, just the recent canonization of him, I don't think it's never accidental when a saint is canonized, but it's not accidental, the timing of it, for its significance. I think the church is clearly going to be pointing towards Newman as a representative of how to properly wade through modernity. The challenge to that is, of course, that there's already been a massive plethora of misinformation regarding Newman's teachings since the period of Newman until this time of his canonization. So it's up to those sound minds, those sound philosophical and theological minds, to those of us that are interested in Newman, to make sure that we are presenting him in a true and authentic way. And none more so, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, there's none more so, I think, that's damaged and butchered his reputation unnecessarily so, but in just as a descriptive reality, than his work on the development of doctrine. Because context, this is the title of this lecture, is remembering, or how do I, no, embracing development, but remembering context. The context of Newman's writing is complex in its own sense, but Newman is writing in a period, he's after Immanuel Kant, he's after Hegel, he's after this influx of what in the Anglican Church at the time was being called liberalism. It was a sort of liberal theology. It would sort of find its way into Catholic theology as the heresy that we call modernism, a sort of progressivism, a Hegelian approach to theology, if you will. And so Newman is responding to this. He's responding to these debates and these arguments, but he does so in a way that it's very difficult for traditionalists, especially the conservative-minded folk, and those voices out there, to sort of wrap their minds around this, because they, and in a way that I think is oftentimes very lazily, they want to just sort of dismiss modernity altogether as if that's even an option. But the reality is that we are modern people. We're stuck with modernity. And Newman is saying, look, there's actually there's some fair critiques that you could draw from some of these modern thinkers, even if their later conclusions might be wrong. There's some things that we have to contend with. And as he contends with these things, as Newman says, as he's contending with these things, we also have to account for the fact that we have a magisterial tradition, scripture, these things that are the foundation that we stand on as Christians, that we can't just like, and so it's often portrayed as a stool, right? You can't just lop the legs off of this stool. So he wants to preserve that stool while also giving a fair assessment of the arguments of modernity. Now, Hegel comes along and says, look, there is an actual evolution that takes place. It's no coincidence that the Darwin's, context matters in a lot of this stuff. The context matters, right? Because it even precedes Hegel in a sense, but certainly from the time of Hegel all the way up to the release of Darwin's work on The Origin of Species, there's this moment where the scientific community is anticipating Darwin. They already believe that there's philosophically this evolutionary thing that's taking place. Change in the true sense, where this thing that was once this now becomes this completely different thing. And so Darwin, it's not like Darwin just presents this stuff in a vacuum. The context was that the foundation had been set up to this point. And as far as Hegel's concerned, this evolution, it's unended, right? It can go off into the future indefinitely, infinitely, antinomies colliding with each other and coming to form this synthesis, this new thing that it produces. But Newman's looking at it from a different lens, right? He's looking at it from a not an evolutionary lens, not a Kantian lens, not a Hegelian lens, as he's sometimes accused of. What he's saying is, look, it's almost as if you have this, like the statue of David, right? It's like just a block of marble. And what development does is it like chisels away at the things that are not necessary to this essential feature that makes up the statue of David. And that's maybe a little bit, I mean, that's a crude analogy there, but the idea is that the progression that takes place in the development of doctrine isn't this evolutionary progression in a Hegelian sense. It's a coming to a greater clarity. It's a stripping away of the things that are unnecessary, not evolving itself into a new thing, but bringing to light the thing that it actually truly is. And of course, like I said, these ideas around marriage were at one time highly contested things. And it's easy as a person that's living in modernity to put the Hegelian lens on, look back into history, and see this whole process, as a Hegelian process of antithesis, synthesis, ad infinitum into the future. But we're going to try it with a little bit of a different lens, with a little bit of a more like complementary developmental lens in terms of what Newman does. In order to not do violence to what Newman's saying, we have to keep the context of all of the historical realities. Like one of the things that Newman actually took on firsthand was the Arian controversy. That would be, I would really go way too far afield if I started to talk about that. But he wants to apply, this is actually where he's coming eventually to this realization about the Catholic Church. You can read about this in his Apologia. He's looking back at the Arian controversy and he's trying to make sense of how do we get from what happens in this moment to the lowercase c Catholic Church that he sees in the Anglican Church today. And he realizes at a certain point that it's untenable. But for the Roman Catholic Church, for the true one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, there is a way in which you could follow from the Arian controversy to the Roman Catholic Church as it exists in Newman's time, as it exists in our time, but it takes a little bit of that, dare I say that naughty word, it takes some nuance. And that's where I say, you know, we as Catholics, to make sense of this stuff, we have to embrace the development, but always remember the context of these things. And again, I think marriage, as we're going to see here, as a helpful marriage as one of the sacraments is a helpful example of this. So, as I mentioned, you have Lombard coming along. He compiles his compendium of sources, this massive Florogia, with his own commentary interspersed in there on various different topics of philosophy and theology. And his work becomes the staple work for the Middle Ages, as many of you are aware. And when it comes to the sacraments, though, it's super interesting because in the time of Lombard, sacraments was not a settled issue. It was coming to, things were crystallizing at this period in time. They weren't like just looking for a light switch in the dark, but we still weren't where we would end up with, say, by the time of the Council of Trent. And so with Lombard, who's writing, let's see, does it say here? Probably says somewhere. Lombard is writing not long after Abelard, 1150s. And so in the 12th century here, he finishes his work on the sentences. And with the seven sacraments, this is what we have. He has baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, penance, extreme unction, orders, marriage. Now, the fascinating thing about is this is in order of importance as far as Lombard is the certainty with which he applies to the sacraments, the fact that it is a sacrament. Baptism, very clearly a sacrament in Lombard's eyes. Confirmation, the Eucharist. Once you get down to holy orders, then it gets a little bit trickier. There's some arguments around that in the time of Lombard still. It's the argument about whether or not this idea of the priesthood as separate from what takes place in the Eucharist, it's still being debated. And then at the very bottom, the last thing that he gives treatment to is the subject of marriage. Now, you would think, okay, well, then he would probably spend the most time with the ones that are higher on the list. Those are the ones that we're more certain about. But actually, he makes note here of, Reynolds makes note here that with baptism, we have, let's see, 4 chapters. With the Eucharist, you have 5 chapters. With penance, you have roughly 8 chapters. With extreme unction, you have 1 chapter. With holy orders, you have 2 chapters. With marriage here, he's got 17 different chapters on marriage with 17 distinct arguments that he's going to present for each one of these. He dedicates, out of these 7 sacraments, by far the most to the subject of marriage. And Lombard is actually of the opinion, and this becomes the consensus opinion of the theologians up until what we're going to talk about here in a second, but Lombard's opinion is that while he believes that marriage is a sacrament, he does not believe that it confers grace. He sees it as simply a remedial sacrament that prevents sin. So it's the conjugal act as an outlet for people to not engage in their lustful passions. But on the theological positive side, he doesn't posit that it's actually something like the other sacraments, which confers a specific grace. Now, when you get to Thomas a little bit later, Thomas is going to be almost a century later. It's interesting for the simple fact that, well, by the time of Thomas, the discussion has changed, but we don't actually get from Thomas's own, maybe from his in the remote sense, from his own mouth, because his students treat on the sacrament of marriage and the supplementum part of the Summa Theologica, but that's not actually the part that Thomas had finished what he was going to write of the Summa Theologica, and then he tragically dies, and then his students complete the work, and it's the subject on marriage that they take up. So it's not Thomas himself, but also they put marriage at the very bottom. So it's still in this like last place, even by 100 years later. Now, as I was saying, with Lombard, it becomes kind of the general consensus among the canonists, those who are not debating the issue, canonists, bishops who are not really trained in theology, which in this point in the Middle Ages is most of the bishops, but bishops who aren't really trained in theology, certainly your average priest, your average couple who's getting married, they tend to just behave as if it's a sacrament. The average, like the praxis, the work, the way it's working on the ground, this is treated as a sacrament. But there's not really much thought given to whether or not it confers grace. This is the kind of thing that theologians are off arguing in their ivory towers. Now, the big shift on the other side is from Alexander of Hales, who's really kind of a pivotal figure in the development of this, because Alex of Hales comes along and says that marriage confers its own specific sanctifying grace ex opere operato, that famous line of thinking from Augustine where the like all the sacraments, that there is a certain working that has been worked upon this sacrament that does not rely on the ministers of the sacrament to confer the grace. And because of that, marriage was, and this is the language that Trent would later apply to it, truly and properly a sacrament of the new law. Now, that doesn't translate down into this. It kind of surprisingly, I guess, I don't know how much of this stuff I would consider surprising or not surprising, but if you're unaware of just kind of how cosmopolitan the Middle Ages is at this point, and also just how sort of tightly bound all of the universities are to one another, and all the various studiums to the major universities, ideas spread pretty quickly. So it is a shift by the time you get to Alexander of Hales, that the universities are starting to move in this direction. But that doesn't translate immediately over to the canonists. The canonists, and as far as the bishops are concerned, it's still held for at least another 100 years. The general feeling is that there's not really any grace that's conferred in this particular sacrament. Okay, so we also have Bonaventure chimes in on it, and even he, so we have it from his own hand because we have his commentary on the sentences on this particular part, where he does, Bonaventure kind of conservatively treads in his treatment on marriage. He doesn't actually say that marriage confers grace, but he does push towards marriage being a sacrament. The one who pushed back against it pretty hard, though, was Peter John Olevi, who followed Bonaventure and Thomas. And he believes, kind of in that Lombardian sense, that, like the Lombard, he believes that marriage, I think he kind of backs away from it a little bit. He doesn't believe that it's univocally a sacrament as the other six sacraments are, or at least the other five, I would say. I'm not for sure where Olevi fell on the sacrament of holy orders, but he would say that because it's not comparable to the other, let's say the other five at least, he doesn't think that he kind of puts it in its own class. So you've got these core sacraments, and then you've got almost like this apocryphal sacraments that do not confer grace. He's very explicit. And another Dominican friar, Durandus, follows suit. This is sort of where the debate takes place. Now, as all of this is going on, you're moving towards this juggernaut of modernity where we end up having, let's say, by the time of Erasmus, or certainly by the time of Luther, you get these people that are arguing for a removal of these sacraments that have been argued going back for centuries by the time you get to Erasmus and Luther. And this is one of the areas where I think this is why context is always so important. Catholics will, I think, mistakenly go after Luther here, go after Erasmus. These aren't the areas that I would particularly go after them for. I do think ultimately they were wrong, but they're wrong in the sense that, like, Peter John Olevi was wrong, right? Like, Olevi had quite a few things that I would take issue with, but they weren't like necessarily, if Luther had just been this character who debated the veracity of marriage as a sacrament, and that's all he did, he would have just been kind of a footnote to history. Of course, the problem with Luther was these later developments on justification and all of the ramifications of that. That's where Luther's really a problem. Erasmus, I kind of critiqued him a few weeks ago, so I won't go back into that too much here, but certainly these guys are within a context of what's taking place at the time, where these things are, especially, Erasmus, highly educated, very trained. Luther, highly educated, trained in theology. These guys knew the history. They knew what they were kind of doing as far as these debates that had been taking place. So they're perfectly within the proper order of how theologians debate things over time. So that's the context. And I think Catholics need to move away from critiquing Luther on this specifically. The change is, and this is like, I think, the real change, and this is an epistemic problem than it is a theological problem. By the time you get to Erasmus, by the time you get to Luther, you do have a consensus building up around these things. Now, this is actually pertinent because recently there's a fire up over three professors that have been let go from a prominent seminary in Detroit. And I don't know the specifics, I don't know the details of what happened with that, but the word around the campfire is, and sometimes the campfire makes, it's like a bunch of grown men who sound like a group of clucking hens. So take that for what it's worth. But word around the campfire is that this was a retribution for their harsh, I don't even know if harsh is the word, for their criticisms of certain teachings coming down from the Vatican. Now, if that's the case, then this goes back here to this kind of question. Where do these, when these arguments are taking place, I'm trying to like paint a picture here. I almost need like a whiteboard or something behind me. It's different for a theologian like Peter Lombard, like Bonaventure, like Thomas, like Alexander of Hales. These guys who are earlier on in the debate. Yes, they are trained theologians. Yes, they are highly educated men. They're arguing these things that haven't really had time to percolate for the church to see how the canonists respond to it, how the jurisprudence comes down on it, how the bishops respond to it, how it sort of permeates out into the world. So when you have somebody like, let's say, St. Thomas or the Thomists arguing around the Immaculate Conception, it's a different thing for, say, an early Dominican in the 15th century, 16th century, for them to be arguing around the Immaculate Conception versus somebody to be arguing around it in the 18th century, in the 19th century. Certainly by the time, and this is the key point I'm getting here, by the time of Trent defines as it's an anathema attached to it, right? So it's a day, I get my grades of certainty mixed up in the church. At that point, it would be a de fide proposition. It's a proposition that has the weight and the backing of the church as explicitly behind it as you can get, just about. It says, these are the seven sacraments, and it includes marriage. And it doesn't make a differentiation between marriage as this outlier quasi-sacrament. It says, no, it's truly and properly a sacrament with, at this point, once the church has settled it, with the same power and the same authority, and to say that it is a, just as much as we can approach the sacrament of baptism. Now, at that point, if you have Protestants who reject it, if you have Catholic theologians who reject it after Trent, then you've got, like, it's a different issue with the Protestants, but certainly within the Catholic circles, it's a problem as well if you were to reject it after the church makes such a pronouncement on it. But even before you get to that point, before you get to the point of Trent, these things begin to coalesce. It's like, look, I can kind of make out the words on this page, right? And as I'm like putting my glasses up to my eyes, I'm like, the words are becoming clearer to me. So as you're like moving towards Trent, it's much different for Erasmus. This is why I hold him accountable here. It's much different for Erasmus so late in the game. It's much different for Luther. Luther was already sort of gone by that point, but certainly Erasmus, who remains in the church, for him so late in the game to be so contrary to the way that the general consensus is moving. Now, that's not to say that a trained theologian on the level of Erasmus couldn't offer some pushback, couldn't be a conservative voice. I think there's a place for that. But some of these people tend to get a little bit carried away in their criticisms of something that's, again, so late in the game. Because by the time that you get to the Council of Trent, there are certain things that have taken place from that early period where Lombard takes this position, Alexander of Hales takes this position. In the interim period, the church has started to make some statements about this, and now that has to be taken into account. So here, Reynolds makes note of Pope Lucius III's Ad Abolendum, 1184. Let's see, the profession of faith that Pope Innocent III sent to the bishops of Vaudois. The profession of faith from the Second Council of Leon sent to Michael Paleologus. That was conveyed by Gregory VIII. Pope Eugentius IV's Bull of Union with the Armenians from the Council of Florence. All of these they begin, for example, including, all right, so what these documents are saying up to this point, and this is what Trent's looking at, these documents are saying, like, for example, with the profession of faith given to the Waldensians that they have to agree to, or what Michael Paleologus has to agree to, or what the Armenians have to agree to, one of the things that is in there, it says, in order to be in communion with Rome, you have to accept these 7 sacraments. And among those 7 sacraments, of course, is the sacrament of marriage. So Trent is looking at that as like, that's clearly the church moving in this direction of seeing marriage as one of the sacraments. Let's see, what else do I have here? I was thinking this would probably be like a 10-minute live, and here I am going up to 40 minutes. So just to kind of like wind this down, I think that when we're dealing with development of doctrine, the context is very important if you're going to wade into these debates, because you don't want to be, I'm sorry, I know I pick on apologists a lot, but you don't want to be that apologist that's making these claims about Protestantisms when all a person has to do now is get on like ChatGPT and type it in, and right there, assuming ChatGPT, has the access to the information, but they could easily find out some of at least the controversies surrounding marriage, coming all the way up to the moment of, they do this for the canon of Scripture a lot. I'd mentioned this last week, and this is sort of the impetus for this live too. With the canon of Scripture, like we have to be careful how we criticize the Protestants about the canon of Scripture, and it comes down to an epistemic argument. Once the church has defined something, does the church have the authority to define something? To what extent can they define it? And so many of these debates that like kind of happen around this stuff that last for centuries ultimately boils down to whether or not the church has the authority to define things. Even with intra-Catholic dialogue, there's clearly a point where when these things crystallize in the Catholic mind, like, okay, Trent gives us the canon of Scripture, Trent gives us the 7 sacraments, the papacy promulgates the Immaculate Conception, or the Council of Vatican I gives us some definitions around papal infallibility, though that one is still being, I think, quite heavily disputed, so maybe that's not the best one. But certainly around the canon of Scripture, certainly around the 7 sacraments, certainly around the Immaculate Conception, there is a level in which, for Catholics, once the church has said something, we kind of just jump on board. The reason, though, I think that jumping on board happens is because there is this context, this long process wherein, if the church had come down early when, say, Peter Lombard is just sort of putting the idea out there, and let's say there's a canonist who's like, look, and the interim period between Lombard and Alexander of Hales' idea sort of taking a foothold, some canonist said, look, we've got to settle this right now. marriage is not one of the seven sacraments. Church say something definitively, and the church sort of prematurely jumps in and makes a statement on it. Then at that point, because we know objectively that marriage is one of the seven sacraments because the church has definitively told us so. So just as a hypothetical, had the church at that moment stepped in and said that marriage was not true and properly one of the seven sacraments, we would have been in error and the church would have defected, and that would be a real problem. So this is a little bit rambling. I apologize if it's too rambling. I want to help you guys get through some of what I think are I was going to do this as one of those quick tip guides for studying history, but I like to keep those at about 10 minutes. And I knew that this one was going to get longer. So I was like, I better just go ahead and make this like its own sort of thing. But it's kind of within that vein. I wanted it to be like one of those sort of tips for you guys when you're studying history, that like as Catholics, it's okay for us to embrace the idea of development. But we have to get out of our mind this Hegelian concept of development as an evolution, as a change in the thing. And there's so many people, gosh, when we talk about like fighting the gates of hell, this is one of the things that I see as the real challenge, that we're constantly having to fight these old arguments again. I looked at, there's some controversy over Mike Lewis. I don't even take him that seriously anymore, but he does manage to ruffle up some feathers. But he was basically saying that these professors at this seminary needed to be expunged because they were dissidents, as if we were, as if we're the Comintern or something, right? And, if you dissent against the dear leader, and like granted, like there is a sense in which we have to be charitable in our reading. And I don't think the average Joe on the street, and this is one of the problems, right, is that the average Joe on the street throws out his criticisms of maybe something that Pope Francis has, and he has none of the context, right? So we are trying to like thwart change that like Mike Lewis would want to put on us, which is a complete change of the way that we've historically gone through the process of these things. What he's offering is what I usually refer to as just sort of a progressive concept of how doctrines develop. And it's not what we're looking for. But at the same time, we can't, just because he makes a machination of change in doctrine and development, doesn't mean that we are free to dismiss it altogether. We have to keep the context of these things in mind, because like with what he's arguing for, the context is that theologians in their academic seats are granted a certain license to make criticisms that like you and I aren't necessarily granted to make. Maybe the bishop has some like completely valid other reason that none of us know about of why he's let these professors go. But if we're following the sort of narrative that's taking place online and it happens to be true, then there is no precedent for just letting a professor go who makes a reasoned, seemingly charitable criticism of a document, that because that's the context of how these things happen, right? Like Alexander of Hales didn't just come in and say, Peter Lombard, you trash, we're going to burn your works in effigy. No, he comes in and says, look, I believe you're wrong here, Peter. I believe that marriage is true. He doesn't use the Tridentine language, but basically he's saying he believes that it's a true and proper sacrament. And then we have a back and forth, and it takes time to get there, but that's how the church works through these things. So for Mike Lewis to come along and say, no, we need to expunge that, like it's clearly antithetical to the way that the church has historically operated. So we have to embrace development. It's in our tradition. It's a part of what we've done, but we just need to constantly keep the context, the historical context and the theological context, where even just sometimes where we're at any given moment. If this is something that you guys don't want to worry about, don't worry about it, right? I mean, if it's just basically try to follow the things that matter, that really matter, the church has been pretty clear about. And you can go to confession, you can receive the Eucharist, you can have a devout prayer life, you can do all of these things and not worry about the state of, something that the papacy has just recently put out about marriage and some dispensation or something like that, right? You don't have to worry about those things. But if you are going to worry about those things, you have to keep in mind, like, the context of where you are in the dispute of this specific thing. So if we're talking about like the issue that these professors apparently had, and again, I'm only peripherally aware of what's happening there, but at least one of them wrote a paper, a book, or something that was kind of like a please answer this criticism of this section of Amoris Laetitia, and that is early in this debate because, as Pope Francis himself had acknowledged, this is something that the church hasn't historically addressed in the way that he was trying to address it. Because I think, much like the problems of modernity that Newman was seeking to address, there are problems that we need to have our eye on and we need to be paying attention to. And we can't just say, oh, let us turn to the manuals and let us flip through this section, this part, this paragraph of this manual and find the answer to some of the things that people are dealing with in marriage today in 2025. There might be some context that we can go back and refer to those things, especially of reference. But if we're like actually at a point now where we need to broaden the conversation, papacy certainly has a power to do that. The theologian's job is to assess that, to absorb it, read it, and then to provide, hey, these are the questions that we have about this. This is a little bit, we're a little bit iffy about this. And the papacy, we have a divinely protected papacy. The papacy is not going to put on us something that could lead us towards mortal sin. So there's that promise, at least. The context of where we're at right now, I would say, as far as what's happening, we're fairly early on it. We do have a lot that's behind us, but the specific arguments that I can see that are taking place around Amoris Laetitia, there is this, the argument seems to be from the theologians, how do I read what you're saying here in light of what's already been said and promulgated multiple times over? And I think that's that's part of Newman's development of doctrine, is to hear the conservative voices, because we are trying to preserve the type. We're not trying to change it. We're trying to preserve the type and bring it to the context of where we're at today. So context, context, context. You have to embrace development. It's there. It's a part of the Catholic Church. It's actually a part of the Orthodox Church as well. It's even a part of the Protestant Church. The Protestants, their response to it is, well, we just keep what we want and we reject what we don't want. But in the Catholic Church, as well as in the Orthodox Church, we have a certain obligation to hold to, like, we can't at this point, we can't as Catholics, and I'll just to use one that's comparable to Catholics and Orthodox, we can't at this point just deny Chalcedon. We can't just deny the two natures of Christ. We have to like hold to what Chalcedon taught. And sometimes some new challenge arises later, as we saw in some of the later councils after Chalcedon, that the church has to address. And so it's in this sense that development occurs. And the Orthodox, they like to pretend that sometimes in their worst and their pop apologetics, and Catholics did this too sometimes with certain pop apologetics, they like to pretend that orthodoxy as you see it today just fell from on high and landed in the year 34 AD when the church was at Pentecost. At that moment, that's when you see the Orthodox Church exactly as you see it today, with the icon venerations, with the Palamos, energy, essence distinctions. Like, no, these things progress over time. They happen over time. You have to be, whether or not you realize it, you have to be accountable to these things. If this is the structure that you're going to hold, Protestants, they did the cheap thing. They did the easy thing. They just sort of like, we're just going to go ahead and get rid of that whole tradition thing. But that tradition as a infallible source of authority. If you're going to hold to tradition as an infallible source of authority, then we have some answering that we have to do for how these things have developed over time. And in order to do that, we have to keep the context. So anyways, guys, going on for about 50 minutes now. I hope you enjoyed that. Let me know what you think in the comments. Like I said, I got some good feedback, not necessarily in the comments, but in some DMs that I received about this last one on marriage. So if there's anything you guys think about it or want to challenge me on, I'm always up for a challenge. Hit me up in the comments of this one. I'll see you next time. God bless.